Good afternoon, everyone. Today we're going to begin economic geography. Now, in the new textbook, economic geography is split into two chapters. Chapter 9 concentrates on agriculture and other primary activities, and Chapter 10 concentrates on manufacturing and services. However, some of the concepts do overlap between the two chapters.
First, we can take a look at a few preliminary photographs. All right, so what you have here is wheat being harvested. And usually in class, I like to ask students, which one of these? Is it harvester number 1, number 2, or number 3? Which one do you think that the farmer is driving? Well, they think about that, and the answer would probably well be none of them, because this is probably an example of a suitcase farm. It's probably part of an agribusiness. The farmer himself may not even live on the land. Those are hired workers that travel with the wheat harvesting seasons. All right, so wheat is a major agricultural commodity, and we'll talk about that. Next up, we have another photograph here. This is an oil tanker, and certainly oil is a very important natural resource. You might argue that it's the world's most important natural resource, since our economy runs on energy, and oil explains most of our energy use. We'll see that the classification of economic activity is also important when we look at Chapter 10. In this chapter, we'll look at the sectors of the economy, and most of this chapter looks at the different methods of agriculture, subsistence and commercial agriculture, and also some issues such as the Green Revolution. Well, what's economic geography? It's all about how different people in different places earn their living, the livelihood systems. Now, everyone's livelihood system, it's influenced by physical geography, but there's also cultural considerations. What level of economic development, political decisions, and economic factors. For example, explaining the distribution of wheat, well, part of it might be explained by the physical environment. Does it have the right kind of climate for it? But there's also cultural considerations. Does the population like breads made out of wheat, or do they prefer breads made out of corn? What level of technological development to grow the wheat? Political decisions are a big part of it. Are there price subsidies for the different agricultural commodities? Are they supported? And what about the demand? The supply and the demand will determine the amount of wheat that's grown and sold. Now, we need to take a look at the categories of economic activity. We have the primary activities, secondary activities, and the tertiary activities. We'll talk about the three sectors of the economy. Now, what's primary mean? Does primary necessarily mean the most important? Well, it's the first one. Primary activities include all the agricultural strategies, and then gathering industries like fishing and forestry, and extractive industries when something's extracted out of the environment, and that would be mining. Secondary activities, the secondary doesn't mean they're less important, but that means that it occurs later. Manufacturing, where you take ore that was mined, that's a primary activity, mining, and you make it into steel, or you take the steel and you turn it into automobiles. So secondary activities includes all manufacturing, processing, construction. Utility power production is usually called a secondary activity too. And then the tertiary sector of the economy is all the services. Now, this includes business services, finance, insurance, legal services, but also personal services, consumer services, such as restaurant work, tourism, and so forth. There's a pretty big category of services, and that's one problem that I have with the three-sector classification. All right, and to sum up, this is what I just told you, but here on the notes, they're primary activities and that they occur first. And man is in most intimate contact with the environment in primary activities. Whereas secondary activities are above that, that's manufacturing. The materials are transformed and so that they have form utility. Logs are transformed into furniture. That's an example of form utility. All right, so secondary activities means manufacturing, processing. All right, now I'm going to share with you the graphic from the old edition of the book, which I actually like better. Now, if you talk to a different economist, they may talk about the three sectors. Some may talk about a fourth and fifth sectors. Now, the reason for that is to better distinguish and characterize what the services are. Here on my little graphic there, I'm asking you the question, which one of these is in the service sector of the economy? Bill Gates, the CEO of Microsoft, even though I know he stepped down, he doesn't do that. Is it Bill Gates or the hamburger flipper down at Harvey's? Which one is employed in the service sector? Well, they both are, but there are different kinds of services at different levels, and they have different values. Now, the trend is that as countries develop, they have fewer and fewer people engaged in primary activities like agriculture and mining. And as a country develops, they have more people in manufacturing. And then as a country further develops, they have more and more people in the services. But doesn't it make a difference what kind of service it is? I mean, you do have low level personal and business services, things like employment as a beautician or as a clerk in a store. Generally, those don't require as much education. But the higher level services, if you're going to be employed in finance or in insurance, R&D, the upper level management, that's called in some classifications, quaternary. It's services, but it's one in which you need to be highly educated to do. And some also distinguish another higher level of economic activity, and that's the quinary activity, and that's the upper level management. Your lower level managers would be in quaternary, and your upper level CEOs would be in quinary. All right, so I always like this better because it distinguishes the services. Say all of the employment in your area was in services, is that good or bad? Well, it's good if everybody is employed in the high level finance and research and development and administration and so forth, but it's not good if all the employment is in low-level services, fast food jobs, various types of minimum wage jobs, and so forth. All right, let's see. It's a couple pictures from your book. Let's see. The picture on the left, harvesting the trees would be a primary activity, and you see a logger cutting down the tree. But then turning the trees into paper is manufacturing, so that's a secondary activity. And I suppose in the building back there, there are people that work in the office. They would be in the service industry. Tertiary. All right, so yes, tertiary activities, that's the services. All right, now let's see. Would you be able to name a job in the primary sector of the American economy? Well, sure. You could say something like you're a wheat farmer, or you're a coal miner. Those would be jobs in the primary sector. All right, how about a job in the secondary sector of the American economy? Well, that would be something like a steel worker, an automobile plant manufacturing worker, all of those in manufacturing, producing their various products, computer manufacturing, and so forth. That would be the secondary sector. How about a job in the tertiary sector? Well, one might be waitress. They're in the tertiary sector, right? But how about lawyer? Is that the tertiary sector? Well, in the classification of our textbook, yes, but I would argue that that's probably more the quaternary. But that's what we have, and most of the books that I see, and most of the graphs that I see out in our popular culture and the news and so forth, generally talk about three sectors. All right, so we have that. Something that I'll add on to that are the terms blue collar and white collar. When you hear the terms blue collar, you're a blue collar worker, blue collar employment, what springs to mind? And how about white collar? What's a white collar job? Well, those are traditional names in our popular culture. Blue collar refers to labor or the workers. It was because in the olden days, the steel workers wore these blue work shirts, or the automobile workers wore these blue workers. And so manufacturers or labor was blue collar. But management, though, in the management, they would be working in the office in starched white shirts. They're white collar. All right, so white collar usually means management. And there's a difference. And which would you rather be in? Would you rather have a lot of blue collar employment, or would you rather have more white collar employment? Well, the trend is these days we have a lot more people employed in the services, and as places develop, as countries or regions develop, you want to have fewer in the primary and secondary sectors and more in the higher level services. Then you're in business. Okay, here's an example from another source where I'll tell you about the quaternary and the quinary sectors. And here's an iPhone example. All right, for the iPhone example, what's the primary? Well, the primary would be the mining of the metals, and then it's plastic, so it's made out of oil. The secondary part of it would be manufacturing the processors, then putting it all together, assembling the phone. And then the tertiary sector of the economy, that would be when you go to the Apple store and they're selling you the phone. So the clerk there is in the tertiary sector. Aha, but we have quaternary. So the quaternary would be the upper level management of that, and those that are in the software development, in the research and the R&D, research and development, the app makers. And then the quinary would be the top level of management. Well, Steve Jobs was the CEO, and now it's Tim Cook. All right, so there's a difference between working in the Apple store, which you don't have to be too educated to do that. You don't have to have a college degree, but in the upper level, the software development, the R&D, the upper level management, you have to generally be a lot more educated and degreed. All right, yes, once again, the secondary sector, we call that blue collar employment. And then the management sector, the quaternary sector, the higher level information processing, that's white collar. Back in the olden days in economic geography, we used to put a collar around each one of the sectors. For example, the primary sector, sometimes we would call that red collar employment because the farmer's kerchief was red. And then secondary sector, blue collar or blue workman shirt. And then the tertiary sector would sometimes refer to that as pink collar because the waitress's blouse or the beautician's blouse is pink. So the lower level personal and business services. And then, of course, the white collar for the management, information processing. And then quinary was sometimes called gold collar because of the gold studs that the CEO would have. Types of economic systems. We'll have three broad types that we'll look at. Those that are subsistence economies, and we tend to classify these as being, say, in the less developed areas where the goods and services that are produced are used locally. It's not for international exchange. Versus market economies, commercial economies, and that's most of the world, where goods and services are produced for sale. And it's supply and demand that determines how much is manufactured, how much is purchased. There's also another type that we'll look at, and that's given the term planned economies. That's another way of saying socialist or communist economies. All right, supply, demand, and market equilibrium. It's good to take a look at this graph that shows the supply curve, the demand curve, and the intersection at market equilibrium. The regulating mechanism of the free market can be visualized graphically here. You look at the first part, the supply curve tells us that as the price of a good increases, more of that good will be made available for sale. Well, countering any tendency for prices to rise to infinity is the market mechanism that the higher the price, the smaller the demand, as customers will find other products more cost effective. I look next at the demand curve. The demand curve shows how the market will expand as prices drop and the good becomes more affordable and thus attractive to more customers. Market equilibrium, shown on the last graph, is marked by the point of intersection of the supply and demand curves and determines the price of the good and the quantity bought and sold in market economies. Now, another type of economy is planned economies, sometimes called command economies, where governments set the demand and set the price and come up with plans, 5-year plans, for example. Now, this is associated with communist countries like China or the old Soviet Union, but China especially has moved towards more of a capitalism market economy as far as the business end of things go. The old Soviet Union was a good example of a planned economy. Here I'm going to show some graphics here that aren't in your textbook. Uh, for example, the Soviets had what they called the 5-year plans, in that the government decided, well, how many rolls of toilet paper they would manufacture and what the price would be. Well, there were always shortages, and you had all these scenes from the Soviet era of people standing in long lines to buy basic products. So it was not only the government determining the supply and the demand of the product, but also the location of it as well. In that the Soviets wanted to develop particular areas, so would put a factory far out in Siberia because they needed to develop that area. All right, so it didn't have anything to do with the logic of the advantages of locating there. All right. Now, I also have a link in the online notes to a very funny Wendy's commercial, Wendy's hamburger commercial from the 1980s about the Soviet system. Well, let me pose this question to you. This might be a essay question or discussion question in class. Um, doesn't matter which way you answer it. It matters how you defend your answer. What about ice cream? Everybody likes ice cream, right? And sometimes you can't afford all the ice cream that you want. Well, what would happen if the government and politicians ran for election and they were saying, well, we're going to make sure that everybody has equal access to ice cream. Ice cream is going to be made low cost, nearly free for all Americans because ice cream is a right, and so we have to provide it for everybody. What do you think would happen? Well, I hope you enjoyed it because you probably wouldn't be able to afford it anymore if you get the government involved.